Shall we pray? O God, guide us into ways of justice and truth. Let the design of your great love shine on the waste of our wraths and sorrows. Give peace to your church, peace among nations, peace in our homes and peace in our hearts. Through your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Foss Center and to this very special event. The Convocation today is an example of how things can come together. We have a confluence of events, or a coming together of two streams to form a very significant and beautiful whole. One stream that has contributed to what we are about has to do with the fact that for over a year now, representatives of 6 Lutheran schools with Norwegian background, specifically Augsburg, Augustana, Concordia, Luther, Pacific Lutheran, and St. Olaf, representatives from these schools have been talking about a series of events that would address the issues of peace, events that would recognize leaders in the movement toward peace, that would bring them together so that we might learn from them and hopefully emulate them. The question on where to find or develop a list of peace leaders was raised early, and the obvious answer was to look to the recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. These recipients are chosen each year by the Nobel Peace Institute in Norway, and its director is Dr. Jakob Sverdrup. The first annual meeting of the Peace Prize Forum is taking place this weekend at St. Olaf. Next year, it will take place at Augsburg. Among the key participants this year, and we certainly hope next year, is Dr. Sverdrup. So that's one stream. The second one has to do with our own history. This school is tied, inextricably tied, intimately tied to Norway. From the days that Norwegian immigrants founded a seminary in southern Wisconsin in 1869, and more specifically, the college is tied to a very particular Norwegian family. The college is 120 years old. 47 of those years, the school was led by first the father, then his son, Georg, and then George Sverdrup. 47 out of 120 isn't bad for one family. And in fact, this very beneficent, helpful influence and support continues today. If you see in your program, this convocation is supported with funds from the Sverdrup family, and as you go out to the reception afterwards, if you go that way through the Sverdrup foyer, you will see another example of how this connection continues. So we have 2 streams, and we're delighted with both of them. To lead us into this morning's event we have Joel Torstensen, a longtime and honored member of the faculty, a leader in the formation of the Scandinavian Center here on campus, and he has some comments and an introduction to make. Joel.
It is a rare occasion when a distinguished member of a prominent historical family can personify the importance of the cultural connections that promote amicable relations between 2 distinct cultural regions of the world. Such is the case of our guest this morning. Historians note that the Sverdrup family has made a deep imprint on Norway's modern history. It has played an important role in the fields of education, politics, science, and religion, and others. It was out of this family that 2 of our distinguished early presidents, Dr. Georg Sverdrup and his son, Dr. George Sverdrup, came. Both of them were keenly aware of the developments of modern Norway as it responded to the dramatic changes associated with the Enlightenment and the ideas of the French Revolution. Georg's great-uncle, the first Georg Sverdrup in Norway, served as president of the Eidsvoll Assembly, which produced Norway's modern constitution in 1814. His uncle Johan Sverdrup was a prominent member of Norway's parliament, a leader of its powerful Liberal Party, and representing that party as Norway's prime minister. Professor Krislock observes in his history of Augsburg College that Johan Sverdrup, the uncle of Georg Sverdrup, our first president from the Sverdrup family, held a position in Norwegian politics comparable to that of William E. Gladstone in Great Britain. That these and other members of the Sverdrup family influenced the thinking of our early president, George Sverdrup, is abundantly clear. Professor Krislock makes the following succinct summary of these influences, and I quote from that book: "The reform movement championed by the Sverdrups in Norway touched education and church affairs as well as politics. In broad terms, it advocated the extension of practical education, practical in quotation mark, revitalization of the Norwegian state church, strengthening of parliamentary institution, and the extension of suffrage." Early in the life of Johan Sverdrup, he developed an intense enthusiasm for the ideas of the French Revolution. Among other members of the family, he believed that the establishment of social and political democracy and equality would not subvert Christianity, as many 19th century Lutheran clergymen feared, but that democracy could and probably would revitalize the nation's religious life. Georg frequently developed this thesis after he reached the United States. End of the quotation from Dr. Krislock's book. It is important to note that both Georg and George Sverdrup were dedicated to high standards of leadership characteristic of the Sverdrups in Norway. They had a high regard for academic excellence. Both were linguistic scholars, competent in the classical languages as well as in several modern languages. Both were students of world history as well as scholars in theology and philosophy. But they spurned both intellectual and social elitism and continued to champion the dramatic democratic impulses released by the forces of political democracy and religious reformism. Now, even as 19th century connections with Norway and the rest of Scandinavia nurtured our life and culture in the past, so now we can look to that cultural region of the world for insights and inspiration for our life and work today. As we commit ourselves increasingly in our academic community to a global consciousness and a more internationally oriented academic program, our contemporary Scandinavian connections can provide important stimuli for our thinking and laboring for peace, justice, and human rights in the world. The Nobel Peace Prize is perhaps the most dramatic illustration of this. Every October 10th, the eyes of the world are focused upon Oslo, wondering who will be the recipient of the next Peace Prize. Recent history demonstrates the significance of that award. For some recipients, the prize provides both world attention and support for continuing their work for human rights. This has been notably true for people like Dr. Martin Luther King of our country, Lech Walesa of Poland, and Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. The global perspectives stimulated by the prize are self-evident, as illustrated by the recent award to President Oscar Arias of Costa Rica and to the United Nations Peace Force. The awards to Mother Teresa and to Elie Wiesel give courage to all of us who affirm that nothing that is human to us is alien. It is not likely no accident of history that the custodian of the Nobel Peace Prize tradition is none other than Dr. Jakob Sverdrup, a contemporary member of that historic family. His discreet investigation of the candidates for the Nobel Peace Prize formed the basis for the deliberations of the Parliament-appointed committee that awards the prizes. Dr. Sverdrup's academic and professional experiences prepared him well for his assignment as director of the Norwegian Nobel Peace Prize Committee. His major academic concentrations was in the field of history. From 1949 to 1963, he served as a foreign correspondent and a foreign editor of one of Norway's leading newspapers. From 1963 to 1978, he was professor of history at the University of Oslo, during which time he produced several historical studies of modern world history. We are honored by his presence this morning to speak to us about the Nobel Peace Prize, Norway's contribution to global harmony. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for the very nice words you said. I am really overwhelmed by the reception I have got here in Minneapolis. And I've never been so proud of being a Sverdrup before I arrived here. So it's really a pleasure and honor for me to visit Augsburg. This is really my first visit, but I have for a long time felt very close to you, linked to you through family ties, because, as was mentioned in the introduction here, George Sverdrup, who played such an important part in the first year, or first many years, of the history of the Augsburg College, he was a brother of my grandfather. And they were both very active persons. My grandfather, and his name was also Jakob, he took an active part in Norwegian politics, belonging then to Johan Sverdrup's party. Johan Sverdrup was the leader of the party, but Jakob Sverdrup, he took part in the government, the cabinet, which Johan Sverdrup formed in 1884. So, and he was Minister of Church Affairs and was very interested in bringing the church closer to the people. That was his political program. Take it away, the power away from the bureaucracy and bring it over to the people. Well, as you know, George Sverdrup, his brother, he chose to do his life's work in the United States. But the ties between the two brothers were very close and strong. They were also both linked to a particular place in Norway, Balestrand, by the Sognefjord, at the western coast of Norway, and to the parsonage where George Sverdrup was born, and where our family still has a summer house. I still remember from my childhood that the second George Sverdrup visited us there at our place. And later on, other members of the family have found their way back to this point of origin. So it was natural for me to dwell briefly on these family ties on my first visit to Augsburg, because they illustrate the close and lively contacts which have existed and still exist between Norway and the Norwegian America. Although the United States is such a vast country and contains so much, and Norway is small, maintaining historical ties and keeping them strong is valuable. And for me it is a particular pleasure that at this moment they are about to be strengthened through the initiative which has been launched to establish cooperation between 6 American colleges with Norwegian background and the Norwegian Nobel Institute. That is why I am here now, and my topic today will be the Alfred Nobel Peace Prize. Alfred Nobel was an exceptional man, exceptional but also typical of his age. He was born in 1833 and died in 1896. So he lived in a century marked by great scientific, technical, and economic progress. In relation to those spectacular developments, he was no passive onlooker, but an active contributor. He was born in Sweden. He should, of course, have been born in Norway. But he didn't live so very much long. We didn't live so a long time in Sweden. He spent his formative years in St. Petersburg, the present Leningrad, where his father had settled as an inventor and industrialist. And the father hired private tutors to his sons. And Alfred, the young Alfred, he learned very early both Russian, German, French, and English, and was really fluent in all these languages. He was also given a thorough grounding in the natural sciences, with chemistry as his favorite subject. He continued to study chemistry in Paris under Europe's foremost teachers, and it is safe to say that this determined the rest of his career. He spent the whole of his life as a European, living mostly in Paris, later at San Remo on the Italian coast. He built himself private laboratories where he loved to be and to work, but also knew how to turn his numerous inventions into profitable industrial products. The best known and most lucrative of them was dynamite. When Nobel died in 1896, he was one of Europe's wealthiest men. He was also a bachelor and thus had no direct heirs. But he had a lot of relatives, his brothers, children, and they were deeply disappointed when his will were published. They only inherited small sums. Almost the whole of the large fortune was to go to the person who in the preceding year shall have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind, as he wrote. And he specified what he had in mind. The prizes were to be rewards for the most important new discoveries in physics, chemistry, and medicine. In addition, when prize was to go, I quote, to the person who shall have produced in the field of literature the most outstanding work of an idealistic tendency, unquote. And the fifth prize should be awarded, I quote again, to the person who shall have done the most or the best work for fraternity between peoples, for the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and for the holding and promotion of peace congresses, unquote. Nobel also stated in his will which institution should award these prizes, and they were, of course, mainly Swedish, with one exception. The Peace Prize was to be awarded by a committee consisting of 5 members elected by the Norwegian Storting, Norwegian Parliament. It is also worth noting that Nobel found it necessary to stress, to emphasize, that the prizes should be awarded without regard for nationality. In fact, when his will was made public, he was criticized in Sweden for lacking patriotism, in not having devoted his fortune to promoting Swedish interests. But that would never even have occurred to Nobel, for whom it was a matter of course to think along international lines. The will tells us a great deal about Alfred Nobel. The 3 science prizes testify to his belief that scientific progress is essential to human progress. This shows him to be a child of his time, the 19th century with its faith in progress. But in him that faith went hand in hand with a critical and pessimistic view of human nature. Material progress and human frailty. That was characteristic trends in Alfred Nobel's thinking, and it is also typical for our situation today, I think. By founding his prizes for literature and peace, he did try to do something to improve human nature. The Literature Prize was explicitly reserved for literature with an idealistic tendency, and the Peace Prize was meant to help to eliminate the threat of wars to human progress. We do not know why Nobel decided in his will to have the Peace Prize awarded in Norway. Although he was a busy correspondent, he never gave any indication of his motives. So we must resort to guesswork. The first point to make is that at that time Norway and Sweden were united under one king and with a joint foreign ministry. So in choosing a Norwegian institution, Nobel did not go beyond the borders of the realm. The next point to note is that he chose the Norwegian Storting as the institution which was to appoint a Peace Prize committee. This suggests that he had formed a favorable impression of that institution. It may have had something to do with the Storting's support for the idea of compulsory arbitration for states which were in conflict with each other, a notion dear to the hearts of contemporary peace movements. What's more, the Storting had allocated funds to the peace movement. Knowing that Nobel wrote his will in 1895, a Norwegian historian would automatically think of the aggravation that very year of the conflict in the Union, for the Union was turning more and more into a conflict. What was it Nobel's intention to express sympathy with the Norwegian cause? Or was he reminding Norwegians of the need to find peaceful solutions? Let me add that many, including the Norwegian-American historian Oscar J. Farnes, have found at least part of the explanation in Nobel's admiration for the Norwegian author Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, who, in addition to being a famous poet and dramatist, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1903, was also heavily involved in political issues and known in Europe as a champion of liberty and peace. Well, all this is in fact guesswork, and we can't come any further to get a definite answer. And a more important question than why Norway was given the honor of awarding the Peace Prize is what made Nobel establish such a prize. It is easy to understand why he established the prizes in science, and the Literature Prize reflects both his own broad human interest and the great interest and prestige which at that time attached to literature and great authors. But peace, wasn't peace merely a notion for dreamers? The King of Sweden and Norway must have been of that opinion, for he disliked the Peace Prize very much and regretted that Nobel had allowed himself to be influenced by, as he said, peace fantasists and especially womenfolk. By womenfolk, the king probably thought of one woman in particular, Bertha von Suttner. And Alfred Nobel and Bertha von Suttner got to know each other when she applied for and got a post as Nobel's secretary in Paris. But she certainly did not keep the job very long, because after 1 week she returned home to Vienna to be reunited with her fiancé, for whom such a long separation had been too much. But even if they just met this 1 week, they got to like it, and they kept going a correspondent the rest of their life, or the rest of Alfred Nobel's life. And he followed her career very closely when she in 1889 published Lay Down Your Arms, the book which made her famous, and in 1890s took an active part in the organized peace movement. In their correspondence, however, he was often critical of her ideas. She cannot have enjoyed reading that, quote, "Good wishes alone will not secure the peace. The same can be said of conferences and long speeches," unquote. And it must have been even worse for her to hear him write that my factories may put a stop to war before your congresses do, because today 2 armies are capable of destroying each other in the space of a minute. All civilized countries will recoil from war and send their troops home." Unquote. There we had the idea that the weapon which he himself had helped to develop would prove so destructive that war would become impossible. His prophecy about the destructive force of weapons has been proved correct, but not his view that countries would see sense and destroy their weapons. We can say that he overestimated the role of reason in relation between states. However, the proposition that weapons themselves would render war impossible was only one of the ideas he put forward. He had others, and we can watch him in his letters working his way toward the view that peace would have to be secured by means of some form of collective security, in which states agreed to cooperate in resisting an aggressor. This solution was, as we know, subsequently attempted by the League of Nations and the United Nations, yet neither organization came up with a real answer to the problem of international security. Nobel's approach to the problem of peace was always based on the idea that all states are essentially interested in peace, and that war could only break out if some irresponsible adventurers took control in one of the great powers. In such a situation, it would be necessary even for peaceful countries to have weapons at their disposal. Although sympathetic towards Bertha von Suttner's agitation for disarmament, he believed that regard for security would prevent nations from going all the way down that road. Nevertheless, we see that Bertha von Suttner's ideas had a surprising impact on the will Alfred Nobel left. Specific mention is made of disarmament and peace congresses, precisely the points on which she had concentrated, and which he, in his letters, had treated with some irony. In short, Bertha von Suttner succeeded in influencing Nobel, and must have her share for the credit for the establishment of the Peace Prize. The Norwegian Nobel Committee must take Nobel's will as its point of departure. The key concepts there are fraternity of peoples, disarmament, and efforts to promote the idea of peace. But the committee also finds it useful to study Nobel's reflection on the question of peace, even though they were not expressed in the very short formulation in the will. And last but not least, it must form its judgments in a situation very different from the one in Nobel's day. In the hope of realizing Nobel's intentions, it must attempt to interpret them in the light of changing circumstances. A literary interpretation of the will could have given some curious results if the Peace Prize should be awarded to persons who had been most active in organizing peace congresses. Then perhaps Joseph Stalin should have had it in the 1950s. The very first award the committee made in 1901 were based on an interpretation which was not equally well received by everyone. The first prize was shared between the Frenchman Frédéric Passy, a leading figure in the French peace movement, and Henri Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross. In the peace movement at that time, they were very well pleased with the prize to Passy, but critical of the award to Dunant, not for lack of respect for his work, but because it was felt that it had nothing to do with peace. The Red Cross helped to alleviate the suffering of war, not to prevent war from breaking out. But the Nobel Committee's view was that even in the thick of a bloody war, the Red Cross represented fraternity among peoples. Ever since that first award, the Nobel Committee has used a broad definition of peace. The laureates include individuals as different as Theodore Roosevelt and Mother Teresa, Henry Kissinger and Albert Schweitzer. The prize has been awarded to leading politicians, persons engaged in humanitarian work, people who have contributed to disarmament, and others who have worked to strengthen the international rule of law. In the latter group, we find both international lawyers and politicians like President Wilson and Secretary of State Cordell Hull, rewarded for their work in connection with the establishment of the League of Nations and the United Nations, respectively. Awards have frequently been controversial, especially when made to politicians, because they often relate to some particular achievement in bringing armed conflict to an end. Theodore Roosevelt's prize was for his contribution to the peace concluded between Russia and Japan in 1905. Henry Kissinger and Le Duc II won theirs for the Vietnam agreements, frail though they proved to be. And Begin and Sadat won their prize for the Camp David peace accords concluded in 1978 with the help of President Carter. The objection to such prize winners is that although a single achievement may be very important, it is not sufficient if the person's record in other respects suggests other than perfectly peaceful intentions. Politicians, therefore, must be handled with care. But on the other hand, it must not be forgotten that they are in a position where they can exercise decisive influence on questions of war and peace. The most popular awards have always been for humanitarian work. The first torchlight procession through the streets of Oslo in connection with the Peace Prize was in honor of Albert Schweitzer in 1952. And of course, Mother Teresa was also an extremely popular prize winner. The concept of peace was significantly extended when the Peace Prize to Martin Luther King in 1964 and Desmond Tutu in 1984. Today, the peace concept comprises not only racial equality, but human rights in general, with Andrei Sakharov and Lech Walesa examples of prize winners who were rewarded for their struggle for human rights under totalitarian governments. Typically, neither of them was able to come to Oslo to receive the award. Both sent their wives. Let us not forget that the Peace Prize, in contrast to the other prizes, can be awarded to organizations as well as to individuals. The recent award to the United Nations peacekeeping forces was very well received. Among the organizations selected for awards, a number have been affiliated either to the League of Nations or later to the United Nations, and the Red Cross has won the prize more than once. Such awards reflect something of the basic idea underlying the Peace Prize: fraternity among peoples and efforts to build up an international community under the rule of law. The prize winners we are looking for will have made outstanding contributions in just those fields. Every year, persons are nominated to the prize, and they are persons who have done a great deal for their fellow men. But the committee has to look for efforts of a content and scope which make them meaningful to the whole world. And we must not forget that even if human rights and humanitarian work is very important, so we must remember that the most fundamental threat which confronts us today is the North-South conflict and the accumulation of weapons of mass destruction. Those are the problem areas where the gravest threats are to be found and where counter efforts are most urgently needed. The Nobel Committee wants to make its modest contribution to promote cooperation instead of confrontation. The Peace Prize is not only a reward for past achievement, but is meant as a stimulus to renewed efforts. In that way, we try to take a hand in the shaping of events.
It is now my privilege to introduce to you the Dean of our college, the Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Ryan LaHerd.
I am pleased to represent the college community, our faculty, students, staff, and friends, in presenting a gift to Dr. Sverdrup as a memento of his visit. We have all been honored by your words, by your presence, and by what you represent. Each year, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists uses a clock as a metaphor for their prediction of how close we are to the war that will bring annihilation to the earth. But a clock can also be a metaphor for our human desire for peace. A clock is a symbol of the shortness and fragility of life, life which war diminishes and destroys. A clock is a symbol of that which all humankind shares in common, the rising and setting of the same sun, the passing of the seasons. And it represents our connection to our times, our past as well as our present, a past which can teach us the mistakes which have led us to war and the decisions and persons who have led us toward peace. On behalf of the Augsburg College community, I am pleased to present this clock to you, Dr. Sverdrup, as a memento of your visit and a symbol of our appreciation. Appreciation for your presence, and appreciation for your work with the Nobel Peace Institute, which has helped move the world closer to the time of peace by recognizing those who strive to make peace. The plaque at the base of the clock reads, "With warmest thanks, Dr. Jakob Sverdrup, Augsburg College, Minneapolis, Minnesota, February 17, 1989, striving for humankind's highest calling, peace."
Well, I just want to thank you for this gift. It was really I who shall thank you for inviting me to come to Augsburg, this very fine place, which I have just had looked around a bit, and I hope to see more of it afterwards. But I think that has been a wonderful experience for me. So thank you very much indeed.
Would you arise and receive the benediction? May the God of hope fill us with joy and peace, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit we may live in justice and in peace. Go in peace, serve the Lord.